Kunis, Venerable Bhikkhus, dear guests. I'm grateful for being here again at this conference after my fine experience in earlier conference 3 years ago, before the COVID crisis. Now, being here again, I will try with my presentation to give a short introduction. How can I, from my job on studying comparative religions, ask, observe, what are big challenges for religions, either in Germany or in Korea, either in Christianity or in Buddhism. And I think you can add in your mind also on the situation on Argentina, on the USA, on India, on Jewish or Hindu and so on contexts. I will try to stick to my manuscript as a kindness to the translator and also to keep with the schedule. So I will try to read. Oh, sorry. What was? Okay, yes. It is well known that the COVID-19 pandemic brought some existential crises, both for religious persons and non-religious ones. Because of the risk of contagion, many public activities or meetings have been cut. People having caught COVID-19 had to isolate themselves, and a huge number had to be hospitalized or even brought to intensive care units in hospitals. My paper wants to discuss some aspects of how religions deal with this situation, reacting to public measures to keep safe and avoid infection, by new arrangements of religious meetings to offer spiritual care, by using online media for religious service, by upholding contacts between group members or parishioners. Further, my presentation takes a look at dying people to comfort both the person until his or her last breath and to help the relatives of the dying one to cope with the grief about the loss of a beloved one. Religious traditions which help people to cope with physical or mental weaknesses are well known. Even if a social crisis or individual misfortune is understood as divine punishment or as the result of karmic causality, religions cannot totally restrain themselves from the world. Therefore, questions about sickness and health, of old age or death, are important to most religions. Looking at Buddhism, it is well known that the Buddha is said to have seen an old man, a sick man, and a dead person, which led him to understand the impermanence and weaknesses of life, leading also to the moral obligation to practice compassion and strive for an inner-worldly improvement. Buddha himself sometimes is characterized as the unsurpassed doctor, and his teachings are medicine. Also, Jesus in the Christian tradition is sometimes imagined as a physician or a healer, either in the literal sense or in a metaphoric way, telling that his teachings are a medicine to gaining spiritual health, like a physician in the world gives medicine to a sick person. There are many other theological concepts when in spring 2020 COVID pandemic started to spread, and so the question arises, what's then going on? If we look at the reactions given by religious communities, one can quickly see two different types of reaction. One type focusing strongly on God without considering mundane or social components, and the second type looking for new ways to combine religious practices as necessary social consequences. Take first the group A. This group or members of this group are simply laying the emphasis on religion and on God's help to protect them in the time of crisis, therefore keeping their face-to-face services, neglecting widely the authorities' ban or at least suggestions to avoid religious gatherings in person. Such fundamentalist groups didn't care for public regulations, as they either saw COVID crisis as an apocalyptic symbol of God's punishment of a sinful world, or they only trusted in the supernatural powers of divine help to save the humans. Consequently, questioning the necessity of worldly cautiousness and also more or less harshly criticizing or opposing governmental restrictions, which they saw as a restriction of religious freedom. Such a position in several cases not only resulted in conflicts with authorities, but also led to the outbreak of cluster infections because the upholding of in-person worship. Most of these cluster infections happened in far-right Protestant churches in Korea as well as in Germany and in other countries as well. The other group B are made up by persons who were ready to follow the restrictions of the authorities, and they look to development alternative forms of worship by virtual means, along quarantine rules or along social restriction, even if they also were critical against the public restrictions for performing service. But they said, well, these are necessary evils for the public health. One can clearly observe that the mainstream traditions of religions, or liberal or progressive group within religious traditions, were more active in following and supporting the authorities' regulations. And one can also observe that within these religious communities, nearly no cluster infections occurred, as they quickly developed sets of preventive measures to prevent the spread of the disease. I think there are two reasons why this was done with the mainstream traditions. The one reason, the well-structured Roman Catholic Church, not only in Korea but also worldwide, could use its excellent networks to propagate its own regulations quickly, in an effective way, throughout the parishes. In a similar way, Buddhist orders like Chogye here, but also Buddhist orders in other countries, with their hierarchical structures, were also successful to provide not only monks, but also layman members and followers of the order's tradition quickly with information about what to do and what to do not. So one can guess one reason why in well-organized religions infections didn't appear in a high level was the structural order that a religion could handle its adherents. The other reason was surely based on ethical arguments for counteracting the spread of the virus. Religious leaders and individual religious persons quickly became aware that the crisis might be a challenge to look for one's own responsibility according to the so-called golden rule. Anything you like to do for yourself, do to the others. And anything you don't like by yourself, don't do to the others. Or on the general rule of the Buddhist principle of not harming anybody else. That means also not harming myself, protecting myself, but also caring to protect the other. This situation also led to some legal discussions, including lawsuits, and in the paper by Professor Schaaf yesterday we had many examples on this. I don't focus on the legal basis, but that's also a background for all the following things. And so this leads to the question on ban or restriction on in-person worship and how to react to this. Communities who followed the authorities' regulations soon developed practices to give spiritual care and support new ways using digital formats as a substitute for physical worship. But it quickly became obvious that the possibilities to change from community service to online service were very different for several congregations. Well-established Buddhist temples, or the well-established Roman Catholic Church and mainline bigger Protestant churches in big cities had much better chances to develop forms of streaming worship online, using YouTube, using Zoom meetings in the service, and maybe broadcast Mass or a sutra recitation on the air. On the other hand, smaller communities in rural areas or in remote areas were less successful to shift from in-person worship to online meetings, also, of course, depending on missing man or woman power with ID capabilities. As far as communities members made use of these forms of services, one can see two results. On the positive side, it is obvious that pre-recorded or video conference meetings allowed cooperation among the community members. They even created or continued bonds between the members. Two cases might be shown as such examples. Already in mid-February 2020, monks of the famous Jade Buddha Temple in Shanghai in China started to broadcast sutra recitations on the internet. A few monks were sitting or standing in the large Buddha hall, their mouth and noses covered with masks. All adherents who regularly attended the large hall to join the sutra recitation stayed at home, sitting in front of their computer, laptop or smartphone. And there, at home, they could listen to the sutra recitation and they could join the recitation recite by themselves also. The second example is from a Roman Catholic background, where you see, in this case, 3 Catholic priests celebrating Mass alone at the altar in an empty church. You can imagine it on the slide. The documentation of this case also referred to a family who was sitting at home in front of their computer, watching Mass, also partaking actively. That means they stand up, they sit down, they bend their knees, they make the gesture of making a cross, just as if they were in person inside the church. So, in some way, it worked. Both examples show that online rituals could work and include the adherents actively into worship and not only consuming a ritual. Also in the field of intellectual teaching and learning, digital tools proved to be an advantage for bettering religious life. Meditation classes in Buddhist contexts, prayers or sermons, encouraging sermons in Christian contexts, aired via podcasts, had just a positive effect to improve mental health stability. Thus, such online activities and online rituals did not change the ritualistic situation totally. Believers who joined the service in front of the computer prepared sometimes, as is documented, for this ritual by arranging a table with the statue of the Buddha, by putting flowers of roots in front of the statue, burning joss sticks, dressing themselves. In a similar way, Christians arranged a table with flowers, with candles, putting a cross on it, also dressing themselves up as if they would go to church. So in this way, it worked. But there was also one, for instance in Catholicism, problem. how to engage with taking the Holy Bread, how to have physical Eucharist or only spiritual Eucharist. Because giving the Holy Bread via internet is not possible. So, as far as I know from some Catholic parishes in Germany, some priests tried to overcome this difference of physical and spiritual Eucharist in this way. First, they broadcasted Sunday Mass via internet with no parishes coming to the church. And then, half an hour later, the priest went outside in front of the church door and he offered the Holy Bread to those people who only showed up for this moment and then went home. Also my own experience, I didn't take part in it then, because I am skeptical if this really worked, but that's only my personal meaning. I had the chance in the parish where I go, we always had open air service, also in winter if it was not snowing. So there was outside, and on one Sunday morning the weather was not fine. And then the priest came and asked those who came up, because the telecommunication was not perfect, if they want take the Holy Bread without Mass. My wife and I, we go home, some others took it. So it shows this flexibility, how to work on this physical or spiritual Eucharist. So, in this way, the positive side. On the negative side, one has to mention that people often said, well, they missed the sensory experience and the direct social interaction. More often than not, members of religious communities mention the following shortcomings. Well, there was no doubt about the positive effect on teachings, on sermons. For instance, songs only performed online did not give this emotional feeling in cases when one was sitting alone in front of the computer. If you sit alone in front of the computer, joining the singing is more difficult, as in cases when all the family, maybe grandparents and children, join and sing together. Then you get some sensory feeling that we are a community, a real community, and not only a virtual community. So this singing together is maybe one of these examples that show it can work, but often it did not work, how to engage socially. The absence of direct physical interaction made it also impossible to develop the experience to encourage each other, despite so-called break-up rooms, which are possible in the internet. Such restrictions on online services had an impact on many communities, regardless of religion. Some adherents lost the contact with the community as long as only virtual service was offered. And some of these did not re-establish the contacts with their fellow believers now when face-to-face worship is possible again. Losing such physical contact with the community had another consequence: less for the well-organized large temples or churches in bigger cities, but a serious consequence for smaller independent communities, smaller minor Buddhist temples in local areas, because religious communities, religious institutions also always depend strongly on financial contribution of their members. Contributions are given when you come to the physical room and you give your money or your financial support after the service. You don't do it by banking accounts. And so, with the breakdown of physical service and physical worship, also the the financial loss can be joined. And besides, outside the religious field, many people lost their job or had reduced financial income, which made it then also difficult to give financial support to the religious community. So this ban or restriction of physical service had both sides. The religious communities were active, were successful in managing it, but we don't have to overlook the bad consequences, which are still a task to be overcome until today. That's maybe more on the social logical side, going to the individual aspect of living and dying with dignity despite isolation. The online services of religions in the pandemic are not only understood as a religious practice, but also as a social practice, of course. There's no doubt that religious activities are related with social well-being, mental health, and some people lost their mental health if they cannot practice religion. Besides physical suffering, like sickness and death caused by the outbreak of COVID, also mental suffering with various anxieties, stress caused by the fear of a COVID infection changed the life. Religious try to give holistic relief, to improve mental health, and one can say that religious always also have the responsibility for the well-being of the whole society. I only refer to, you know better than me, of course, example from Korean Buddhism, which already during the period of the three empires, long time ago, was understood as a counterprotecting Buddhism, and rituals were performed in the course of history to bring blessing, to bring protection to the peninsula of Korea in periods of war, of famine, of other crises. Look for instance, for the some practices which are able to help with this. I have on the next slide one quote from Sun Master Tang from the year 1988. Of course, you know, nobody talked then about COVID. Just remind yourself that everything, including my job evaluation, my livelihood, and whether I keep or lose it, whether I'm better or worse off, that's all working of you, your foundation. If someone keeps entrusting everything to their foundation like this, then it won't be too hard for them to experience the taste of this Buddha nature by themselves. So, if you're walking meditation, lying down meditation, all are one. Everything can be meditation. I shortened it a little bit. A similar quote from the Dalai Lama from 2014, also before the COVID situation. If we watch the mind and can prevent its being overpowered by disturbing emotions, we can try to lead it towards virtuous qualities. All good qualities come through having a mind that benefits other sentient beings. We are social animals. We live in a society in which the very basis of our existence is cooperation and mutual dependence. Cooperation is founded on the attitude of loving towards each other. If we have that, there will be peace and happiness within our families, our neighborhoods, our society at large. Similarly, in Christianity, I could add some quotes, and also referring to the paper by Professor Jen Choi before, when he mentioned passing by the MSBR. It is maybe a mix of Western and Buddhist thought, as Kabat-Zinn is strongly involved in Buddhism, or was strongly involved in Buddhism, but even if he says MBSR is not Buddhist. It is Buddhist, I think, in some way. So, the COVID infected persons with the risk of dying at the opportunity made it also necessary to do religious practices. Doing religion can help in the situation to prepare for death. And all religions know traditions to prepare this way of a good death. A good death means I can do my ritualistic preparation, and if it is an ugly death, a terminology developed in medieval Europe, but I think the idea works at any time, in any place. An ugly death is a sudden death. You cannot prepare for the journey to the hereafter or for the process of rebirth. And both Christian as well as Buddhist traditions have such instructions. COVID shortened or prohibited such a preparation, even in those cases when no monks, priests, religious professionals which could lead someone to avoid an ugly death were isolated due to social restriction. So, bad experience happened in these cases. Buddhist instructions for gradual training of the mind to calm one's mind so that one can prepare for rebirth couldn't work in that cases. Various Buddhist traditions emphasize that the dying process continues over a longer period. Dying in an intensive care unit in the hospital causes a fear of dying, death anxiety, and this dulls the mind, therefore causes a bad rebirth. Death anxiety and the missing of calming the mind is not restricted to Buddhism. So I can also refer to other religions. They can example in the Catholicism the so-called anointing of the sick. That is in Roman Catholic tradition one of the sacraments. It is a right to prepare for a sick person or a person on the deathbed for the other world. There's a traditional picture from the 19th century, a Catholic priest accompanied by a so-called servant bringing the holy bread, the communion, to a person somewhere outside. To go there, to give the dying person strength to prepare for the last rites. So this picture just should illustrate them on this way. Now, isolated in an intensive care unit with quarantine, also restricting religious professionals to give mental, spiritual, religious support. That was the problem, and this was the challenge, how to tie in dignity. Of course, you know, Buddhist ideas and Christian ideas on the life after death are different on the theological level. On the practical level, how to cope oneself with these problems, with these expectations. If the ritual, the service was missing, it created both problems to the dying person, but also to the survivors, for the family, for the relatives who could not overcome the grief of losing a beloved person. That was one of the problems, and so it's a quite short conclusion. You can read it nearly by yourself. The COVID pandemic had an impact on religious life and will have a further impact as religions have to react to the consequences, to win back members. They had adapted the services. Some of these adaptations will work good also for future, to keep it. But also some negative aspects have to be resettled better. The restrictions of hospitalized persons in isolation, missing support to work with the fear of death is a problem which in any other crisis, and you can maybe, on an historical point of view, refer just simply 18 years ago to the tsunami disaster and the dramatic reactions if non-working religious rites at the moment of the sudden death. So there is a lot of things. I hope you could take some input from this, and thank you very much for your interest.
Thank you for the interesting talk. 시간은 조금 초과되었습니다만.
Although we are constrained by time, maybe we can entertain one question from the audience. Do you have any questions?
없으시면 제가 간단한
If not, then I'm going to briefly ask you the question.
팬데믹 강제격리로 인해서
Because of the
death를 맞이할
isolation,
찬스가
yes, as you said, that there are very little chances for the patients to have the so-called good death. Now, I believe that we'll never be free from COVID-19 in the future. So we'll continue to face the challenge of COVID-19, which means that we'll live in an era with little possibility of good death or death with dignity. So what's your idea on overcoming this challenge? So that's my first question. And second question is that in this era of COVID-19, the religious professionals such as the monks and priests and pastors, for the general public, what kind of solutions they can suggest for the spiritual care of the general public?
Oh, it's very difficult because I don't know what's going on in the future. I think I'm optimistic. We have advantage of better medical care now. And so maybe the number of hard isolating cases will shrink and will come back to a normal level. We always had people dying in intensive care units in hospitals on anything as before COVID. So I think the positive thing is the number of the hard cases, I think, will reduce. But of course, from this experience now, I think it is still the necessity of training clergymen, monks, and so in this way to work, find a balance between fear, isolation, also be careful to avoid infection and to do spiritual care. Just an experience from the parish church where I'm attending from time to time. The local priest was very, very restrictive. I think it was not always necessary to be so much restrictive. He was much more restrictive than the local government had told. So he long time shut up the church absolutely. And he still avoids to meet people. I think that's the extreme case which is not the mode which should work, because there's people are waiting. Okay, I go to church. I want the service in whatever way. But just to say, okay, it's a bad situation, the church doors are locked, that is a problem. How to work with these problems? I think that is one challenge, how to train religious personnel to work better. It is an experience which come to quickly and nobody was prepared for it. So this is one, and looking for the future in my experience. The other things, okay, you can improve the technical streaming of a sutra recitation or of a Catholic Mass or something else. That's clear.
Okay, thank you very much.